They gave my brother the penthouse. They gave me a broken farm. They had no idea what was buried under it. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and cheap coffee, and I remember thinking that was a strange thing to notice while my father's will was being read out loud. I was sitting in a stiff leather chair between my daughter Claire and my late father's empty seat at the head of the table, and across from me sat my younger brother Derek, his wife Vanessa perched beside him with her hand resting on his arm like she already knew what was coming. My name is Thomas Whitfield. I'm 65 years old. For 30 years, I taught high school science in a small town outside Bozeman, Montana, raised 2 kids on a modest salary, and never once asked my father for a dime beyond what he offered freely. My father, Frank Whitfield, built a cattle and construction supply business from nothing, starting with 11 acres and a rusted-out truck back in 1968, and turned it into a company worth close to $30 million by the time he passed at 89 years old. The attorney, a thin man named Harold Pruitt, who I'd never met before that day, cleared his throat and began reading. To my son, Derek Whitfield, I leave the penthouse residence at Cascade Tower, Unit 4100, along with its full furnishings, valued at approximately $5 million, as a gift for his continued dedication to growing the family business. Derek didn't even try to hide his smile. Vanessa squeezed his hand. To my son Thomas Whitfield, I leave the property known as Sundown Ridge Farm, together with its outbuildings and equipment. That was it. No dollar figure, no qualifier. Just an address and a pause. I felt every eye in that room land on me, and I felt my face go hot with something between humiliation and grief. Sundown Ridge was the farm I grew up on, the one my father moved us off of 40 years ago when the cattle business dried up and he pivoted into construction supply. It had been sitting empty for over a decade. Last I'd seen it, the roof of the main barn had partially caved in and the fences were more rust than wire. Derek didn't say a single word to me on his way out of that office. He didn't have to. His smile said everything. He believed our father had finally made it official, that I was the disappointment, the one who chose a modest teacher's salary over the family business. And Derek was the golden son who deserved the golden reward. I want to tell you something about my father before I go further, because it matters for everything that comes after. Frank Whitfield did not make sloppy decisions. He built an entire company by triple-checking every contract, every shipment manifest, every dollar that moved through his books. The man taught me to read a balance sheet before he taught me to drive a truck. A man like that does not accidentally leave his eldest son a falling-down farm and his youngest son a $5 million penthouse without a very deliberate reason. But grief has a way of quieting your instincts, and for the first few days after the reading, I let the hurt drown out the part of my brain that kept whispering that something didn't add up. Claire, my daughter, is a forensic accountant. She spent the last 12 years digging through corporate books for a firm that specializes in uncovering exactly the kind of financial rot most people never see coming. She drove up from Denver the weekend after the reading, ostensibly to help me sort through Dad's old paperwork. But I could tell from the moment she got out of her car that something was bothering her too. "Dad," she said, standing in my kitchen with her laptop bag still over her shoulder. "Did you ever see Grandpa's actual estate planning documents? Not just the will Pruitt read out loud. The underlying financial statements, the trust paperwork, any of it." I told her no. I'd never asked. It felt disrespectful to go digging through my father's business affairs while his casket was still fresh in the ground. "That's the thing," Claire said slowly. "I called the county recorder's office this morning just out of curiosity. Professional habit, you know how I am. The penthouse Derek inherited wasn't purchased outright by Grandpa. It was bought 18 months ago through a shell entity called Ridgeline Holdings, financed with a series of large wire transfers. And Ridgeline Holdings shares an address with Whitfield Construction Supply's accounting office. I didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck anyway. You're saying the company paid for the penthouse. I'm saying it's possible somebody used the company's money to buy it, and then dressed it up on paper to look like a personal gift from Grandpa in the will," Claire said. "I can't prove that yet." "But Dad, $5 million doesn't just appear. Somebody moved it, and somebody had to sign off on moving it." I thought about Derek's role at the company. 6 years ago, our father had brought him on as chief financial officer, trusting him with exactly the kind of authority that could move $5 million through shell companies without a second signature required. I thought about how, over the last 2 years, my father had started seeming distracted whenever Derek's name came up, how he'd started asking me strange, almost testing questions about honesty and family loyalty during our Sunday phone calls. Questions I'd brushed off as an old man's rambling. Before I drove out to the farm, I made one more stop. Earl Duncan had worked as my father's ranch hand and later his equipment foreman for almost 40 years, retiring only after his knees finally gave out 3 winters ago. He lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, and when I knocked on his door, he looked at me for a long moment before saying, "Took you long enough." "Dummy." I asked him what he meant. "Your daddy was out at Sundown Ridge a lot more than folks think." "These last 2 years, Earl said, waving me inside and pouring 2 cups of coffee without asking if I wanted one. Told me once, must have been last spring, that he was putting something right that should have been right a long time ago. I didn't ask questions. Wasn't my place. But he had me haul concrete out there twice, and he made me swear on my mother's grave I wouldn't mention it to Derek or that wife of his. Did he seem scared, Earl? Worried about something? Earl set his cup down slowly. Your daddy built an entire company out of a rusted truck and 11 acres, son. I never once saw that man scared in 40 years. But the last time I saw him, about 2 months before he passed, he looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not sick tired, betrayed tired. He told me, Earl, I raised 2 boys to be honest men, and I'm starting to think I only managed it once. I didn't know what he meant then. I think I do now. I left Earl's house with my chest tight and my hands unsteady on the wheel. My father hadn't just been quietly planning something out at that farm. He'd been carrying the weight of what he'd discovered about Derek almost entirely alone, trusting only a retired ranch hand and apparently a lockbox buried beneath a shed floor. To eventually tell the rest of us the truth, I decided it was time to actually go look at Sundown Ridge. The drive out took 45 minutes along a county road that hadn't been repaved since I was a teenager. The farm looked worse than I remembered. The main house was intact but sagging, paint peeling in long gray strips. The barn's roof had a hole in it big enough to see daylight through from the outside. Weeds had swallowed most of what used to be the vegetable garden. It looked exactly like what everyone assumed it was, a worthless piece of land my father had unloaded on the son who didn't matter as much. I spent the first afternoon just walking the property, remembering. I found the tree where my father taught me to whittle. I found the collapsed remains of the chicken coop I'd built with him when I was 12. And then, standing near the old equipment shed, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The padlock on the shed door was brand new. Everything else on that property was rusted, rotted, or falling apart. But that lock was clean, recently oiled, the kind you buy at a hardware store within the last year. Not the kind that had been sitting exposed to Montana winters for a decade. My father had been out here recently, and he'd locked something up. I didn't have a key, so I drove into town, bought a pair of bolt cutters, and came back the next morning. Inside the shed, past a wall of old tools and a tractor that hadn't run since the Clinton administration, I found a section of the floor that looked different from the rest. A rectangle of poured concrete slightly newer than the surrounding slab, with a steel hatch set flush into it, the kind of root cellar hatch you'd find on farms built for tornado shelter. Except this one had a combination lock on it, also new. I called Claire immediately. She told me to try our father's birthday, forwards and backwards, then my mother's birthday, then the year the company was founded. None of them worked. It was Claire on speakerphone, who finally suggested the one number that made sense the moment she said it out loud. The date my mother died, 11 years ago. The lock clicked open. Beneath the hatch was a narrow set of concrete steps leading down into a small underground room, maybe 8 feet by 10, dry and cool, lined with steel shelving. On the shelving sat a fireproof lockbox, several sealed banker's boxes, and, I want to be honest, because it startled me as much as it will probably startle you, a rifle case, empty, and a small stack of gold coins in a velvet-lined tray. Maybe 40 of them, each one heavy in my palm. But it wasn't the gold that mattered most. It was the lockbox. Inside, I found a handwritten journal in my father's unmistakable block-letter handwriting, along with a thick manila folder of financial documents, and a sealed envelope with my name written on the front in his hand. I sat down on those cold concrete steps, and I read that letter twice before I could bring myself to move. "Tom," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you did what I hoped you would do. You didn't sell this land off the moment you inherited it, and you looked past the surface of things, same as I taught you. I need you to understand something before you go any further. I love your brother. I have loved him since the day he was born, but loving someone and trusting them with everything you built are two very different things. And I made the mistake of confusing the two for far too long." He went on to explain that 18 months earlier, during a routine audit ahead of a bank refinancing, he'd discovered a pattern of wire transfers routed through a shell company neither he nor his longtime bookkeeper had authorized. It took him 4 months of quiet digging, hiring an outside forensic auditor under a false pretext to confirm what he suspected. Derek had been siphoning funds out of Whitfield Construction Supply for years, dressing the withdrawals up as equipment leasing costs and vendor payments to a supplier that, on closer inspection, didn't actually exist. The total came to just over $5.1 million, and the crown jewel of that theft was the Cascade Tower penthouse, purchased through a shell entity and quietly furnished, while Derek told everyone, including our father, that he was simply doing well investing on the side. My father wrote that when he confronted Derek privately, Derek didn't deny it. He begged, he cried, he blamed gambling debts he'd been hiding for years, a habit that had spiraled far past anything he could control on his own salary. My father, heartbroken but not blind, told him he had 90 days to begin repaying the company, or he would be reported to the authorities and cut out of the will entirely. Derek did not repay a cent. Instead, my father wrote, Derek and Vanessa began quietly pressuring him to update his estate plan, suggesting gently at first and then less gently that perhaps it was time for Frank to simplify things and consider his health. My father, sharp as ever even at 89, understood exactly what that pressure meant. He suspected they intended to have him declared incapacitated if he refused to cooperate, or worse, that they were simply waiting him out. So he built a trap of his own. He instructed his longtime attorney, a man he trusted completely, to draft a will that appeared on its surface, to reward Derek exactly the way Derek expected to be rewarded. The penthouse, formally gifted in writing, which would appear to legitimize the very theft Derek had already committed, effectively laundering it through the estate. Meanwhile, he left me Sundown Ridge, the one piece of land in the family that Derek had never once expressed interest in, because Derek had always seen it as worthless. What Derek didn't know, what almost nobody outside my father's closest circle knew, was that 11 years earlier, right around the time my mother passed away, my father had quietly signed a mineral and subsurface lease agreement with an energy company exploring natural gas deposits beneath several ranches in the region, Sundown Ridge included. The lease had been dormant for years while the company waited on permitting, but 6 months before my father died, that permitting cleared. The updated valuation the energy company sent him, sitting right there in the folder in my hands, placed the extraction rights beneath Sundown Ridge at an estimated $38 million over the life of the lease. My father had left me a farm that looked like nothing and was actually worth roughly 8 times what he left Derek, and he had done it quietly, deliberately, specifically because he suspected that if Derek knew the truth ahead of time, he'd find a way to seize it, forge it, or destroy it before I ever got the chance to understand what I was holding. The letter ended with instructions. Everything in that lockbox, the financial evidence of Derek's embezzlement, the true mineral lease documents, a signed and notarized statement from my father, describing the entire scheme in his own words. Dated and witnessed only 6 weeks before he died of a sudden heart attack in his sleep. All of it was meant to be found by me, and only me, once I proved to him without ever knowing I was being tested, that I was the son who wouldn't simply walk away from a piece of land just because it looked worthless on the surface. I sat in that cellar for a long time. I won't pretend I wasn't angry. My father had let me sit through that humiliating will reading, let me believe for days that he valued me less than my brother. All as part of a plan he never lived to fully explain in person. But underneath the anger was something else, something that settled slowly into my chest as I understood exactly what he'd done. He had protected me. He had protected this land. And he had made absolutely sure that whatever happened next, Derek would have to answer for what he'd done in the open, in front of a court, rather than quietly inheriting the proceeds of his own theft. Claire drove up the same night I called her with what I'd found. She spent 6 hours going through the financial documents at my kitchen table, cross-referencing wire transfer dates against the shell company filings, building a timeline so airtight it made my head spin just watching her work. This isn't just embezzlement. Dad, she said around 2 in the morning, rubbing her eyes. This is federal wire fraud. This is falsifying corporate records to secure a real estate purchase. Depending on how the notary who witnessed the fraudulent original will gets treated, there could be a conspiracy charge in there too. I asked her what she meant by the fraudulent original will. She pulled up a scanned document Dad had included in the folder, a copy of an entirely different, unexecuted draft of his estate plan, one written 8 months before the version Harold Pruitt had read aloud, one that split the company and all assets evenly between Derek and me, with no mention of any penthouse gift at all. Attached to it was a note in my father's handwriting. HP confirmed D approached him directly in March, asking about accelerating my incapacity determination. Trust broken. Proceeding with contingency plan. Documentation secured. F.W. Harold Pruitt, the attorney who read the will, the same man my father had trusted for decades, had been approached by Derek to explore having our father declared legally incapacitated. My father found out, and instead of simply firing Pruitt, he used him, letting Pruitt believe he was helping execute a straightforward estate plan while secretly building the exact evidence trail that would expose everyone the moment I found it. 2 days after I found that cellar, before Claire and I had even finished cataloging everything inside it, Derek showed up at my house, unannounced, Vanessa trailing behind him with a folder of her own tucked under one arm. I hadn't told either of them anything about the shed, the hatch, or the letter. I hadn't told anyone outside Claire and Earl, which made the timing of their visit feel less like a coincidence and more like a warning shot. Tom, we need to talk about the farm, Derek said, standing on my porch with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Realistically, that land is a liability. Taxes, upkeep, liability insurance if anyone gets hurt out there. Vanessa and I did some digging, and honestly, we think the smartest move is for you to let us handle a sale. We know a developer who'll take it off your hands fast. No repairs needed. Cash offer within the week. I asked him why he suddenly cared so much about a piece of land he'd called worthless at the will reading. Vanessa answered before he could. We're just trying to help you avoid a headache, Thomas. Frank left you that place because he knew you'd never say no to sentimental value. But sentiment doesn't pay property taxes. I told them I appreciated the concern, but I wasn't interested in selling anything right now. Derek's jaw tightened in a way I recognized from when we were kids, and he didn't get his way. He pushed a little harder, mentioning a number, then a slightly higher number, clearly expecting that if he offered enough, my resistance would simply dissolve. I told him again calmly, that the farm wasn't going anywhere, and eventually they left. Vanessa's heels clicking sharply against my porch steps on the way back to their car. I didn't understand the urgency of that visit until Claire, 2 days later, traced the timeline of a call placed from Derek's cell phone to an energy company representative's office, less than 72 hours after our father's funeral. Derek hadn't known about the mineral lease specifically, but he'd known enough, apparently through some old conversation with our father, to be nervous about what might be sitting in the ground beneath that property, and he wanted it gone from my hands before I ever had reason to look closely. That visit told me everything I needed to know about how badly Derek wanted this handled quietly, and it told me exactly how little time I had before he tried something more aggressive than a friendly offer on my porch. We brought everything to a new attorney the following week, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata Ibarra, who specialized in estate litigation and corporate fraud. She reviewed the documents for 3 days before calling me into her office. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "what you have here isn't just enough to challenge the current will. It's enough to potentially unwind the entire transaction that financed that penthouse, freeze your brother's assets, and refer this whole matter to federal prosecutors for the wire fraud alone. The mineral lease paperwork is airtight and predates your father's death by over a decade, which means there's no argument that this was some deathbed manipulation. Your father built a case file most district attorneys would consider a gift. We filed the challenge quietly, without warning Derek, and Renata coordinated with the county prosecutor's financial crimes division to begin a parallel investigation before Derek had any chance to move money or documents. It took another 6 weeks of forensic accounting, subpoenaed bank records, and testimony from the outside auditor my father had secretly hired. Before everything was finally ready, the confrontation happened in a probate courtroom on a grey Tuesday morning. Derek walked in wearing an expensive suit and the same easy confidence he'd worn at the will reading, clearly expecting a formality, a minor procedural challenge he assumed I'd lose. Vanessa sat behind him, arms crossed, radiating the same quiet contempt she'd shown me for years. Renata stood and calmly laid out the timeline. The shell company, the falsified vendor payments, the forged furnishing invoices, the March conversation with Harold Pruitt about incapacity proceedings, which Pruitt, once confronted with the documentation and facing his own potential disbarment, confirmed under oath had absolutely happened. And finally, the sealed statement in my father's own hand, notarized 6 weeks before his death, laying out the entire scheme in language so precise it left almost no room for argument. I watched the color drain from Derek's face as each piece landed. I watched him turn to Vanessa for reassurance and watch her slowly lean away from him instead, her arms tightening around her own purse like she was already calculating her exits. When the judge asked Derek if he wished to respond, he stood up, his voice cracking, and tried to claim the funds were a loan he'd always intended to repay, that his father understood and approved, that this was simply a private family matter being dragged unfairly into a courtroom. But the wire transfer dates didn't lie, and the fabricated vendor invoices for a supplier company that literally did not exist in any state business registry, made his claim collapse before he even finished the sentence. Renata calmly pulled up one final exhibit on the courtroom monitor, a recorded voicemail my father had left with the outside auditor 8 weeks before he died. His voice steady and clear, walking through the exact dollar figures, the exact dates, and the exact phrase that ended up echoing through that courtroom in a way I will never forget. "I want this documented properly," my father's voice said, filling the silent room. "Not because I want my son punished, because I refuse to let a lie about my company become the truth simply because I'm not alive to correct it." Derek sat back down without another word. Vanessa's arms tightened around her purse, and I watched her eyes drift toward the exit doors at the back of the courtroom, calculating. Already several steps ahead of him, 2 financial crimes investigators were waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom. Derek was formally taken into custody that same afternoon, charged with wire fraud, falsification of business records, and attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Given my father's advanced age at the time, Derek approached Pruitt about incapacity proceedings. Vanessa, when questioned separately about her own knowledge of the shell company and the source of the Penthouse furnishings she'd spent 18 months decorating with, quickly began cooperating with investigators, offering up text messages between herself and Derek discussing how to keep Dad from finding out in exchange for leniency on any conspiracy charges against her. I won't lie and tell you it didn't hurt to watch, even after everything. There's a particular kind of grief in watching two people you once shared holidays with turn on each other the moment the money runs out. The Penthouse was seized within the month. The shell company's assets frozen and eventually returned to Whitfield Construction Supplies accounts. The judge upheld my father's final will in full, the one Pruitt had read aloud that day in his office, Sundown Ridge Farm, with everything on it and, crucially, everything beneath it. Legally and permanently mine. It's been 4 months now. I'm sitting on the porch of the newly repaired farmhouse at Sundown Ridge. The barn roof finally patched, the fences rebuilt, the mineral lease payments already arriving quarterly from the energy company. More money in a single check than I made in 5 years of teaching. Claire drives up most weekends, and we've started talking about turning part of the land into an agricultural education center for local schools. Something my father, I think, would have genuinely loved. Derek is currently out on bail, awaiting federal sentencing, facing what his attorneys privately admit could be a minimum of 6 years. Vanessa filed for divorce 2 weeks after his arrest and has already moved to a rental apartment in Denver, having surrendered every item connected to the fraudulent purchase as part of her cooperation agreement. I think about my father a lot out here, especially in the evenings, when the light hits the ridge the same way it did when I was a boy, learning to whittle beneath that old cottonwood tree. He never got to see any of this play out. He never got to watch Derek's face collapse in that courtroom, never got to see me finally understand what he'd quietly built for me underground, in the dark, out of nothing but distrust for one son and unwavering faith in the other. But I think he knew exactly how it would end. I think that's why he wrote that letter the way he did, why he chose to test me instead of simply telling me, because he needed to know, one final time, which of his sons would actually dig deeper before walking away from something that looked worthless on the surface. Never assume the smallest inheritance is the least valuable one. Sometimes the people who love you most hide their greatest gifts in the places nobody else thinks to look, precisely because they know exactly who will and won't bother looking. Have you ever discovered something about your family that completely changed how you saw your own inheritance, financial or otherwise? Tell me your story in the comments below, and if this one kept you hooked until the end, make sure to like and subscribe for more true story narrations every week.